Well, hey everybody, welcome back to Telling God's Story. Last week we got to learn about God creating the heavens and the earth, the entirety of everything that is. Today we're going to look at God's special creation of mankind, of Adam and then Eve. Start reading at Genesis chapter 2, verse 4 through the end of the chapter. All right, so when we looked at Genesis chapter 1, one of the things that we observed is that God creates everything out of nothing. Now God sets out to create Adam and Eve. The creation of man does not involve, and God said, and then it was so. Instead, what mankind has is a far more intimate creative action that God takes. He scoops together the dust of the ground. He forms it into the shape of a person. And then he breathes into this creature the breath of life. And it's at that point in time where God combines this flesh with spirit that comes from him that now you have this human creature. This actually tells us a little bit about biblical anthropology, about what it is to be a human being. It tells us the ingredients that God uses to make us. He uses body and soul. He uses flesh and spirit. He uses dirt and wind, I guess. Human beings, apart from all the rest of creation, can be described in that sort of way. And what's really interesting is that one of the effects of sin, and we'll talk about this in a future study, but one of the effects of sin is death. Romans 5 talks about that. What happens when a person dies? Flesh and spirit are separated from one another. Right? A person's body is laid to rest in the ground. A person's spirit is at rest with Jesus. But that person looks forward to the day when Christ fulfills his promise to reunite them body and soul so that they can once again have that humanity restored to them. Now, one of the things that we see in Genesis chapter 2 that becomes sort of controversial almost amongst people is these ideas of head and helper that are expressed here in the creation of man and woman. God says in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, "It's not good that the man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him." So it's not good that there's just Adam. Adam is supposed to exist in relationship with someone else. We talked a little bit, I think, in the last video about how creation reflects God's character. And God always exists in relationship with himself, within the Godhead, the three persons of the Trinity. And so human beings created to exist in relationship with one another. So God creates Adam. It's not good. He's not done yet. So he needs to create this one that completes the first one to get to the point where now it's all done. And so he creates Eve, this helper for Adam. Now, Eve and Adam, they're giving this relationship to one another, head and helper. And sometimes we see that as a relationship of status. So if Eve is described as helper, she must be not as important as Adam, not as valuable as Adam. But nothing could be further from the truth. God, the Holy Spirit, is referred to as helper in John chapter 14. Jesus is said to have a head in 1 Corinthians. God the Father is described as Christ's head. These are ordered relationships that God creates for a reason, but they're not relationships that are ordered in such a way as to denigrate someone or to be an abusive situation at all. Rather, these relationships exist to, first off, reflect God's character, existing in community with himself. Also to reflect the calling, the vocations that God has given to these human creatures. These relationships exist to bless one another. Adam and Eve, this relationship God creates between them, is intended to be a blessing to them both. Eve helps Adam be what he's supposed to be so that he can function as a head for Eve, for this first family. Adam, when he functions as head, that's always a role of service, not one of abuse. So God creates these roles with a reason, with a purpose, because he's creating community between people and ordering the relationships that people have with one another so that they don't become chaotic. Now, why don't we see these relationships working properly in our world today? Well, the answer to that is honestly why most things don't work the way they're supposed to, and that is that sin enters the picture. So at the end of Genesis chapter 2, what we see is creation as it's intended, where there's this Garden of Eden, and now he's placed in this garden these first two people, Adam and Eve, and everything just works right. Everything is functioning in harmony. harmony. Adam and Eve, they live together in harmony with one another. There's no tension or strife or sin against one another. They're living in harmony with nature around them. The trees are giving them all the food that they need. They don't have to worry about the storms or the cold or anything like that. Everything is just working right. And they live in harmony with God. There's no sin that keeps them separated from God, such that we even read in Genesis chapter 3 that God is walking in the garden of the cool of the day. Like, this is a regular thing that he happens to do. Adam and Eve, they hide from him there, presumably because they know that he does this sort of thing. It's almost like if you imagine a little marble placed in a channel, a groove that's been created specifically for it with just the right amount of incline, so that when you put that marble in the groove, it's just going to go, because that's what it's made to do. That's how it's made to be. That's Adam and Eve in the garden. That's creation as God intended. Everything functioning in harmony. And that is something that gets ruined with the lies of the serpent, the fall of Adam and Eve, and sin that enters into creation. All right, so now we have the stage set for one of the most terrible, depressing things that ever happened, which we'll look at our next time in Genesis chapter 3, the fall of mankind. But even in the midst of that fall, what we'll see is that God is still there with his promises of redemption, grace, mercy, and peace. So be back again next time as we continue telling God's story.